Okay, let's proceed with Scott talking about bridging the gap and scalable data management for scientific workflows with IOwarp.
Okay, hello again. My name is Scot Breitenfeld. I am from the HCF group, and today I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk about a little something different, and that is in terms of scalable data management for scientific workflows, what we're calling IOwarp. This is a project led by the PI Sun from Illinois Tech Institute, IIT, and there's many co-PIs on this project from the HCF group, IIT, and the University of Utah, and this is a NSF-funded project. So I'm probably going to preach to the choir here. I'm going to talk about scientific I/O challenges, and if you've been paying attention to the talks all in the past 2 days, I think we're going to try to concentrate on maybe not an industrial type of I/O challenges that you're seeing, but more at a university lab type challenges. And for this project, we are starting off with a material science workflow that the University of Utah is doing. So they have a CT X-ray experiments going on where they have raw data formats that depend on the machine that they're using and the application. So that's the data collection part. So they have a dedicated computer station just for interfacing with the instrument. Then once they have that data, they need to do some analysis of it. So they have two other compute stations. And usually when you have more than one computer, it's because one for licensing issues. So you might have a license for one machine, and then that's not valid on another machine type thing. Also, there might be differences in hardware. So in their case, they have two other machines, and they have two commercial softwares. They also have a way to do using open source projects, but this talk's going to focus on their commercial use of these applications. So the first one is Dragonfly. It's an image-based processing software, and it outputs its own file format, ORS session. It's just a binary file. There's also another program that they use on another computer, which is Simpleware Scan IP, and that they use that to do some image-based meshing, so they can do FE analysis on it, and that has again its own output for essentially Abacus in their case. So that's the software analysis part. So if we go on to discuss some of the challenges with the scientific workflows, of course, maybe not in the case of this use case, but as you've seen all the talks, that you can have massive data volumes from these instruments to terabytes to petabytes. You also have storage and infrastructure challenges. So as you know, it can be costly, not only on on-prem sites, but in the cloud to upload and download these data sets. You also have a large variety of data, so you can have a diverse format, text, images, sensor data, or closed format data. It's also difficult to extract some of this data because you can have a lack of structure or a lack of standard in some of these formats. And then finally, how the scientists are organizing their metadata. It might be difficult to start training your data for these type if you don't really understand how they're storing the metadata, whether the metadata is stored, for example, in an HDF5 file, or it's stored in a separate file, or they're using the file name to store all the metadata. Going back then to the material science workflow, so looking a little more in detail, so you have the tomography of the machine where they get the actual 2D images, then they stitch these 2D slices to try to extract a 3D volume. So they here bring up three more challenges. So you have the integration barrier, so you have a restriction between these external tools. In this case, this might have a closed file format, so it's hard to hook in another piece of software to do this analysis. You also might have to clean up the 2D slices from the machine before you get a good 3D volume. So that's a very time-consuming process, and you can introduce more errors trying to fix these to get a good 3D analysis. And then you need to, once you get the 3D volume, you have to inspect that to make sure it actually represents what the 2D is telling you. So you want to ensure at all these stages that you have accuracy and reliability and then trustworthiness of the data itself. Going back to the material science workflow then, so the high level overview, in this research lab, and I think it's typical of a lot of university labs, is that the research group has their own data storage, and in this case they call it research hub. So this allows all the researchers to collaborate with the data, so they store all their data and they can just share amongst themselves. And so, for example, if one scientist wants to do a Python analysis or something for ML training, they can just pull from that on-prem site. They also want to be able to organize their data. If they're planning on publishing it, they probably want to put that in a special place or upload it to the cloud using Globus or GitHub so that other researchers can then verify their data. In this case too, they also like to make 3D models of their 3D volumes. So in that case, you might want to bring in a 3D modeling package like SolidWorks. And of course, they use the HPC Center there on site at the University of Utah to do their analysis of their materials. So this brings up the final points of the complexity. So as you've seen, the data can be very complex. It can be high dimensional, heterogeneous, and it has complex relationships not only between the different packages, but the data itself. You want the algorithm to be scalable. So for the 2D slice, you want the performance to be just as good as making, if you have 1,000 of those slices, you want the performance to be just as good as if you had 100,000 type of slices. So you want that to scale up as well. And of course, you have the interpretation of the results. You want to be able to handle the complex analysis and to get the scientific insights. And usually nowadays, they're starting to look for AI and ML tools. The problem with that, of course, you can introduce the risk of finding false relationships in these large data sets, and you can also introduce some bias and uncertainty. So you have to have a tool that kind of makes sure that doesn't happen. And then you want to develop appropriate methods. So you want to tailor your analysis depending on what your data characteristics are. So you want to also introduce versioning and provenance. So for example, for that 2D images, if you're cleaning up that 2D images, you probably want to keep the original image before the cleanup and then version that, and then keep the images that you've cleaned up to create your 3D volume. And then finally, of course, you want to be able to share your data across different disciplines so other scientists can verify it. So then let's go on to IOwarp. We are introducing a kind of a framework that is aimed at resolving some of these workflow challenges. So the first being the diverse data repositories. We wanted the tool that can efficiently connect these various external repositories and platforms and then seamlessly integrate and transform them. We also want to be able to map legacy data and then unify this type of data. So as you saw in the previous example, there was a lot of different formats. We want to be able to use all those different formats and not have the scientists have to worry about converting from one format to the other, depending on what software program they're going to use. We also want to provide an adaptable interface for complex data manipulation. So I'll talk about that a little later. In terms of workflow, you want the tool to be aware of what the workflow steps are and manage those steps as it progresses, and you want to do that in an efficient manner. We also want to optimize those tasks that may be not needed or should be included, and these have to take into account that the environment that they're running on can be heterogeneous. And you also want to accelerate the I/O in any way possible using, if they have advanced storage systems or resources, you want the framework to know of those advantages and take advantage of them. And then finally, I think it's mentioned a couple days that it'd be nice if the scientists could interact using a natural language with the data and then pull it out. And for that, we're going to introduce what we call Warp GPT, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides. And then you want to, of course, enable the AI and ML frameworks within this context. So in terms of IOwarp, this is a pretty new project. We have probably been working on it less than a year, but the framework and the examples and the tutorials and the documentation can be found on GitHub. The research group also has a project page at IIT that also contains more of the same, of those documentations. But basically, it consists of 4 components. You have a platform plugin interface, a content simulation engine, a content transfer engine, and then a content exploration interface. And I'll talk about how those are related next. In terms of the platform plugin interface, well, it's basically an interface that boosts the adaptability by linking external tools. So what that means is you can integrate with resource schedulers. For example, if you're running an HPC system, you can think of Slurm. So the PPI should know how to submit a job. It should also know how to request resources depending on what your data model is. Another feature of that PPI is workflow manager. So it should know how to map the tasks between sorry, it should know how to map the tasking depending on what tasks need to be done. And you also want to be able to monitor those tasks as they progress. You also want the scientists to be able to use any of their own libraries or software in these tasks. So they can use, for example, any compression that they want, do any analysis programs they're using, tracing, encryption, or any AI. So for example, for the University of Utah, they might find it beneficial to switch between different AI models. And finally, you can kind of think of the platform plugin interface. It's just basically a way to orchestrate the next 3 components and the tasks. So it kind of is the overall conductor of all the tasks and tells what to run next. In terms of the content assimilation engine, this is just a way to ingest the data. This is our engine to read different formats and then normalize these data formats as it's processed. So the first thing it's going to do is ingest the data, and it should understand how to connect to different remote repositories. So it can be the parallel file system. It can be an object store as S3. It can interact with HSDS, streaming services, or other databases. Once it ingests it, it should know how to transform it. So if it's related to a standard like NetCDF or some Excel file, it should understand it and try to unify it into an internal representation within the IOwarp framework, and that's what we call content. And then once you do this internal representation, you have to keep some metadata around to explain what you did to get it into this unified format. What this has the benefit of doing is downstream components will not have to take into account what type of data it is because it's been transformed into this unified data format. And it should be able, from the University of Utah, going back to that case, it should be able to handle all these different file formats. Next up is the content transfer engine. This is basically a way to manage the data movement and placement of data. If you're familiar with IIT's Hermes project, this was a project that essentially makes use of the different hierarchical memory layers. So for example, if you have a machine that has RAM, NVMe, SSD, and a parallel file system, it knows how to manage the data flow between those different abstract layers. It also knows how to do multi-tiered I/O. So it knows how to use the storage hierarchy, and then it can place, depending on the I/O pattern, which data is where. So if it knows that if this analysis is latency sensitive, to move that to the faster tier. It also knows how to optimize the placement, so it'll learn as you go along that the strategies for moving the data and when to move it and where to move it. It also knows the backends for the cost of moving some of these data between the storage layers. So it knows the cost going from NVMe to the parallel file system, and it can take into account that aspect. And normally this is all hidden from the scientists, so they don't have to worry about being able to use, for example, the no local storage. It all is handled for them, which is a nice thing. And lastly, there's the content exploration interface. So this is basically a way to introduce querying and indexing component into the workflow. We want it to be human and AI derived querying to extract the insights to the scientific data. You want to have ability to do advanced querying capabilities. We want to build and maintain the metadata so you can do fast access, so you can help train the models with your data. As I mentioned before, then we are going to introduce something called Warp GPT, which is basically a language model that's trained on that specific scientific data. So for example, I have this use case where you can do a trivial one. If you, for example, if you want to find the grain boundaries lengths for all the samples in the last week, the large language model should be able to pull out that data and then return it to the scientist. That's the dream. And then the second would be to maybe do more complicated analysis, doing correlations depending on different variables in the experiment, and then return back that type of analysis. So that's part of the content exploration interface. Finally, what we envision IOwarp to be is, as I mentioned before in the Monday talk, is that for IO, it's just no longer a matter of storing and then retrieving data efficiently. You have to now be able to work in all the stages. And if you remember my graph between the computation side, the experimental side, and analysis side, all your data has to be efficiently handled within that workload. And it's not just enough to be efficient in just one thing or the other. And we really hope that IOwarp will help focus on the insight for the scientific data. So we want to be able to encourage the scientists to use smart analysis, but really hide a lot of that details from them so they don't have to worry about moving data around and doing different analysis, the nitty gritty. And I kind of use this example of in the olden days where before you get a computer, when you wanted to do a plot in a paper, right, you use French curves and letter stencils to get these nice graphs. And of course, nowadays you can just do it with a push of a button. And eventually what we want to then is just, we'll have this graph and you'll have many of these graphs and you can train your ML to extract data now from these type of graphs many times over. And that's the kind of vision that we hope to enable with IOwarp. So yeah, as I said, this is a new project and we are always looking for, as I said, we are starting with this material science one, but we hope to, as it matures, IOwarp starts to mature, to look for other use cases from the scientific field. And that's all I have here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. That seems like very complex, but yet
Ambitious, yes.
ambitious and organized system. Do we have any questions? So how far you are in your progress? Is it just the beginning or you?
Just the beginning, yeah.
Oh, okay, so.
Yep. A lot of I think we've given demos, and it was interesting that one person brought up how to interact with the data, especially HDF5 data. And there was a Call the Doctor session where Anthony from IIT gave a demo about interacting with the data HDF5 file, and it did a very good job. So if you're interested in that, there is a Call the Doctor he did, or he did some LLM to inquiry the HDF5 file.
And is the whole work is based at the University of Utah or?
The material science aspect is all from the University of Utah. The Hermes and all is happening between IIT and the HDF group.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.